Thank you. Thank you, Kim. And thank you for coming to our session. We do hope this is insightful for you. So maybe you do think you know how to manage a library budget. If you do really think you know how to handle and manage a library budget, I'd love to talk with you individually afterwards. So the purpose of our exercise is to help you understand what it is we go through at the library. We want to inform you of some of the issues that we have to face and address, and most importantly, explain the budget realities that we live with. We're going to talk about some tough questions, explore priorities. We're going to crowdsource solutions. That's why we have you in groups, and talk a little bit about future issues. So, the frightening realities. The reality is our library budgets are inadequate and unsustainable and do not keep pace with the cost of collections, particularly journals and databases.
So I'm Mary, and part of my job is, I forgot that I'm taller than Debbie. So I'm Mary, and part of my job is to handle the collections and be responsible for the collections at Towson University. So what I thought we would do is, we're talking in general about academic libraries, and particularly academic libraries, large, comprehensive public institutions, of which Towson is, with approximately a 23,000 head count. But we wanted to be also somewhat specific. So the figures that I'm using here for our collections funds are specific to Towson University. And so I did like to use that as an example, with the understanding, of course, that all universities, all academic libraries have different budgets, and some are better funded and some are not so well funded. But some of the realities are the same, even with these different funds and collection funds. Okay, so right here I have broken out, and these are Towson University collection funds. And as you can see, what we spend on collections, and then what we spend on access and support. And one of the surprises that in many universities, we do have to, we take out of our collection budget the money for access and support. In other words, the money for cataloging, in our case, over $50,000 a year, the money for document delivery, ILL, our archives with Content DM, bindery, and also for copywriting reserves. So even though this isn't content, we still have to take this out of our collection budget, and that is not unusual. So a typical spending pattern for most academic libraries is somewhere to 70 to 90% is spent on e-resources. And that is actually only growing. Towson University, we're right at 85% on e-resources, and that will probably next year be more. So what this means is that what we're spending, what our expenditures are, and what our funding is, what this means personally for Towson University is a deficit. And for several years, we have run a deficit somewhere in the vicinity of $300,000. Some years a little more, some years a little less. So, and this again is also not an unusual situation. So how we deal with this is what we're going to be talking about in the next few slides.
So as a library administrator, I'm responsible for making sure that we stay within our budget. And because our collections budget is never enough to cover our expenditures, I am always moving money around within regulations, within the guidelines of our university. So I do things like, and this is, again, not unusual, reallocate funds that were supposed to be for print materials to e-resources, take funds from supplies to cover collections funds, from technology to like equipment to cover collections. We have requested funds from academic departments, asking them to subsidize costs of subscriptions and databases that are related to their disciplines, and of course soliciting donor funds. One thing about that for Towson University, as a state-supported public institution, we do not have a long history of endowments and donors to the library, whereas some of the private institutions that you may be familiar with have wonderful, beautiful, enviable endowments for collections. We don't. So these are some of the cost factors that we are always looking at. We have to look at every year, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail later. But FTE pricing, and you are probably all aware of this. FTE pricing, looking at the total full-time enrollment equivalent of a university, is very different from looking at what the FTE is of a specific discipline. So we are not a research institution, but we're a large institution. One of our consortial members is a research institution, but has a lower enrollment than we have. We have to pay more for databases in some disciplines than the research institution pays, even though they have doctoral programs in particular disciplines, and we don't, simply because we have more enrollment. So the total FTE versus discipline-based FTE is something that we're always wondering about, and you'll get a chance to think about that in a minute. Inflation, as you know, 3 to 8% is it's an average inflation for journals and databases. The inflation for some materials, some journals, some databases is much higher. We look at bundles versus unbundled materials, obviously disciplines, the difference in pricing, formats, and then other cost factors come into play from particular vendors and publishers. So these are just a couple examples, again, for Towson University. A database with streaming media, streaming video, can cost $19,000 a year. A database with full-text journals can cost $25,000 a year. These are not the highest prices that we pay, and they're obviously not the lowest, but just some examples for you. Databases with ebooks, $50,000 a year we pay. And bundled journal packages, we have one that we pay $150,000 a year. So, think about all of that from the perspective of a librarian when we're trying to make decisions, when faculty come to us and say, well, we have this new program that's just been approved and we need library materials. That's one of the questions we're asked, one of the requests we get. How are we going to make those decisions?
Okay, so at this time of the year, one of my biggest jobs is reviewing everything that we get as an e-resource and making the decisions of what we are going to continue to subscribe to and any possible cancellations. And we have a number of factors that we look at. We look at the current holdings, we look at accreditation requirements, we look at any possible new programs and any program growth or decline. But the biggest factor and the most important factor that we look at is usage, or cost per use. So I have a couple of examples here, and when I say cost per use, that really doesn't have anything to do with how much the journal or e-resource cost. I mean, we could have a a journal that costs $100, but if it's only used twice a year, that is a $50 cost per use. Basically, the cost per use is the cost of the e-resource divided by the usage, which gives us the cost per use. We could have another journal that costs $2,000, but we have over 1,000 uses, so really that's only $2 per use, and we have some that are much less. So it doesn't really, even though how much we pay is obviously important because that is how we have had problems with the deficit. Still, when we're looking at cost per use, we're looking at how it's used and the fact that it's an expensive journal or a not expensive journal. Again, it depends on how many people are using it. And that is also why usage statistics are so important, and particularly counter usage statistics. So we have some kind of comparison that we are using the same across the board for everyone, as much as is possible for that. Okay, so we have a number of expenditure strategies. And the first one we have here, and we've had this for a long time, is to cancel a journal to buy a journal. And anytime we have a request from a faculty member or for a department about adding a journal, that's a given. We can't add it unless they agree to cancel something. So that's the first one we've done. We've had comprehensive cancellation projects, and that's been sort of an ongoing sort of endeavor. One of the things we're looking at right now is relying on aggregator databases for full-text journal access, even though there are embargoes in many of these. We're trying new purchasing models such as UDA, PDA, DDA, and relying more on interlibrary loan. Now, of course, another strategy we have here is to overspend the budget, and that is, that can cause a problem. But I will have to admit that we have used that strategy before.
And I haven't been fired yet.
Yes, that's right. We're still here. But again, we're doing it we have a fairly narrow range for which we will overspend the budget. But we've done it. Okay, so the last slide I have here that we're going to talk about is the publisher's role. And we'll talk about this more when we have our scenarios. But there are a number of things that when we're working with publishers and vendors that are really important. And one of them is pricing transparency. This is particularly true when you're talking about large journal packages, so that we can see exactly what it is that we are subscribing to versus titles that are, well, I call them access-only titles that are included in the package, and sometimes that's difficult to find out exactly what it is we're purchasing. The different kinds of pricing models, as we talked earlier about the FTE pricing, which for a large public institution like us can sometimes price us out of the market on something. Payment models. We have discovered that having different flexible payment models, particularly ones such as PDA and UDA, are very helpful in the ability to try new resources that maybe we wouldn't have been able to do before. Again, the usage data is extremely important because that is how, for a large part, how we base what we're going to subscribe to in the coming year. And then the last one I have here are licensing terms. And licensing terms can be a real roadblock when we're trying a new resource, because for most state institutions, we do have to abide by all state regulations. In other words, for Towson University, we're from near Baltimore, so we have to rely on Maryland regulations as to what we can and cannot sign. And when there are different licensing terms, restrictive terms, such as for ILL, governing law, indemnification clauses, these are all terms in a license that can be an issue, particularly as far as the state goes. So, and then that requires negotiation. It requires a lot of back and forth. It makes it longer, harder, and more difficult to actually subscribe to a new e-resource, again, depending on the terms.
So that gives you a little bit of background on some of the issues that we are facing. And what we want to do is turn some of the questions over to you. So let me explain what we're going to do, and then we'll give you your assignments. We have 5 scenarios. They're on your handouts. I'm going to tell you what the title is and whose perspective you'll be taking for your conversation. When we assign you your scenario, what we would like you to do is have someone, and we're not going to have a lot of time. We're going to have about 10 minutes for you to do this. So someone be the recorder, because we're going to collect your notes and suggestions afterwards and try to put them together in some kind of response to get back to all of you, and it'll help us as well. So you need a recorder, and then you need someone who will stand up and report real quickly to the rest of the audience what you came up with for your solutions. So scenario 1 is from the librarian's perspective, and it's looking at a new database that's been requested. Scenario 2, again from the librarian's perspective, is about journal packages. Scenario 3 is from the publisher's perspective, and it's a conversation about FTE pricing. Scenario 4, from the publisher's perspective, conversation about consortial licensing. Scenario 5, from the publisher's perspective, a conversation about journal inflation. So, let me go. I'm just going to point to what you're going to do. So, scenario 1, here, 2, table in the back, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. You two may want to join another group. So 1, 2, and 3. All right, does everybody understand what you need to do? So it is 10 at 12. We're right on target, and I'm going to, actually we're ahead of time, so please go ahead and do your work. And around a little after 12 noon, I'm going to ask you to report out on your findings. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll come around and talk with you.
And also, if each of you could choose someone who will actually be the one to report out.
Okay, we've only got 12 minutes, so I'm going to ask for volunteers for each scenario. If you've got something to say, if you came up with a solution, I'm going to try to go around fast. So who wants to talk about scenario 1? Scenario 1. Somebody has something to say, right?
They do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is a difficult issue, right? So we need $10,000. We've already canceled everything we can cancel. Do I understand this scenario correctly?
Yep.
So the only not terrifically creative ideas we had were, one, to go back to the program and see if there are funds, within the program. And then the second was to find out whether there's any possibility for individual access for the resource that might at least close the gap, for a year. We don't know obviously whether, because this is theoretical, right? Whether this is a database that has individual subscription access that, say, if the program weren't huge, could 5 faculty and students
Like a site license?
subscribe personally.
Oh, personal subscriptions.
Some kind of a personal subscription.
And have that be subsidized by the department or the library
have
or
them
something?
pay that
Okay.
if they couldn't find the $10,000 for, so, as I said, no easy answer, I guess,
Right,
to this.
right.
So,
I had one other.
yeah, good.
So my question, I don't know if this ever happens, but it said there was good usage and good reviews of the product by the users. You ever go back to the users and say, okay, we understand this is really useful, we don't have budget for it. Does anybody have any funding, either through a grant or, maybe through the department or the college or what have you? Does that
Yes.
sort of activity happen?
Yes, it does. And in fact, there was one, I can't remember the name. There's a database that's got a really long name. It's in the social sciences, political science, geography, I don't know, anyway, 3 or 4 departments came together and contributed money. One of the problems with that, and this was a scenario we used with our own staff, what if one of those departments decides to pull out of the arrangement next year? Then what do you do? But that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, scenario 2. All right.
Okay, yay, scenario 2. So we thought that we had to follow the data, really, in this scenario to see what was being used, to solicit opinions from the various departments as to whether or not this journal package and the items would be used, see if there'd been user requests as we assess the journal package, and then from there, when we made a decision, we thought we could perhaps trial the package first and then measure data as well surrounding that, and really get an understanding as to whether or not the additional titles are worth it. If they aren't, and our data leads us to discover that they're not, we would look into purchasing the highest used journals individually. But we also thought that there might be opportunity, like the previous team suggested, to solicit funds from other departments if this was really in demand and depending where the request had come from.
Those are good ideas. Let us give you an example of something that happened. We were just talking about last night or this morning, I can't remember, but we canceled, let's see, there was a package, at least one package, that, no, before we got to the packages, we did a major journal cancellation a number of years ago. We canceled anything that was available in a package. Then we needed to, years later, look at the package and decide if we were going to unbundle it. It turned out that some of the so-called free access titles had more use than the ones we were actually paying for the bundle. And that's because we had canceled subscriptions to those 5 years earlier, but the faculty didn't realize we had free, or the students didn't realize we had free access to it. So it was getting a lot of use, but we weren't really paying for it. So we really got ourselves in a tangle trying to figure out how to untangle that.
Scenario 3, or you have a question?
Couldn't you have swapped certain packages, journal subscriptions that were not getting used to those journals that were getting used and get perpetual access to those?
You can answer that.
I mean, again, it does depend on the package. And so many packages, what we got as access titles were they were just given, and sometimes they were taken away. While the ones we were paying for, it is true that some of those we could do a small amount of switching, but not that large. And what Debbie was talking about, part of the reason we got ourselves into such a tangle about it was when we did the initial cancellation project. When we did that initial one, our first response was anything that we had electronically. If we had a separate e-subscription for it, we canceled it because we had it available. But we didn't really look to see, okay, it's in this package, great, we have it electronically, full text, canceled. While in reality, a lot of those that we canceled were actually, quote, access titles because we didn't have a good handle on what we were actually paying for versus what was access. And that was part of the reason that we had written there about transparency, because it was, at least in one package, it was extremely difficult to get what we were actually paying for. We'd had the package for a long time, they were not itemized, things had been added and subtracted, and we truly didn't know for sure what we were paying for and what we didn't, but that's how it ended up. So.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, I'm sorry. Scenario 3? 3, all right.
No, to her. Okay, so this is obviously a tough one too. A few things that were brought up in our conversation was that the FTE pricing is quite US-centric, and the fact that, as Shige mentioned, in countries like Japan, younger researchers don't necessarily use English resources yet. So it's a tough one-size-fits-all solution. Same, we were talking about maybe relevance with Carnegie class or just bands in other places, but again, also quite US-centric. Cost per use being a consideration to roll into this as well. And that can also sort of normalize some of the discipline-specific discussions. And what happens with, when you normalize cost per use, it's going to be different for each discipline. That's what you were saying. As a librarian, you'd have a lot of that expertise to understand and validate what's relevant for those decisions. And then also just thinking about things as we go from this book economy to a digital economy or digital use of a product. And it's complicated. So good luck, guys. I don't know. Sorry, and I'm glad I'm not in
Come
your shoe, I
on, we're
guess.
looking at you for answers here.
Okay, scenario 4. No? Yep.
Short and sweet here. We did see that there were various criteria we could consider as a publisher, and we decided we were a small publisher with a small package of e-journals to sell to a consortium. We could look at Carnegie class, we could look at FTE, we could look at the budgets of the libraries in the consortium. All of these could affect the pricing, but then we thought we would appeal to the libraries in the consortium most to keep the model simple. So we would have a price depending on the number of libraries in the consortium who signed up for the package. More libraries, lower price.
Thank you.
5.
Okay, this was meaty. So right off the bat, why do journal costs keep rising? Some of the usual suspects: demands for features, not just from libraries about, say shibboleth or sushi or, stuff you need to operate efficiently, but also demands from our other set of customers, our editors and our authors, which you may or may not find valuable, which we understand.
We don't even always know all of those things. So.
Yeah. And then a new one, well, not new, but compliance. And we talked about this in terms of both
ADA.
Legal compliance with our physical plant, for instance, upgrading buildings that we're in, but also the hot word on the streets these days is the accessibility compliance with the WCAG. That's going to be a real cost for us to figure out where we stand in that. There's a cost of citizenship as a mission-driven publisher, sponsorships at meetings, going to meetings, participating, canceling one journal drives up the cost of other journals. We need to maintain our revenue level at least, even if we can't grow it. Dropping book purchases to shift money over to serials drives up. If you're like Duke University Press and your journals underwrite your entire book publishing operation, your dropping book purchases is going to drive up the journal costs. OA, we don't think APC in the long run, especially in some disciplines, is really going to be a solution. It may be a solution to the library budget problem, but not the real cost problem. So what to do? We really focused on sort of immediate things, unbundle where you can free up your budget. We as publishers need to be willing to negotiate and be flexible and just eat the cost that goes into negotiation. Give you options. And we feel like, if we can both come to the table as collaborators working toward a common goal and with that mindset, then that opens up flexibility and options. And then the last bit is some of the larger commercial publishers who've gone beyond publishing and put out tools that are very valuable in the scientific community, for example. They point to that as what their journal revenues have funded. And we're wondering, is there a different way, is there another aspect of the university that can fund those developments instead of driving it all off the back of journals, subscription costs, and library purchases?
Very good points. Thank you.
So we're out of time, which I hate to say, but let's give our librarians a round of applause. Give yourself a round of applause for participating. And if you want to come up and ask some questions and keep the conversation going, they'll stay.
And please, those of you who took notes, if you could either leave them with us or you can email them to me. My email address is on the handout there, dnolan@towson.edu. That would be really helpful, and then we can compile the responses that you have given us and send them back so that you'll have some idea of what happened today. Thanks a lot. I just forgot, I just remembered, someone had asked about a real-life situation we're in the midst of right now. I'll just tell you this. If you want more detail, you can come up and talk with us. For FY17, our fiscal year begins July 1st, we have to cut $400,000 worth of expenditures. We did not get a budget cut. That's how much we've been subsidizing our collections budget from other sources the past couple of years. We now have to cut 500 journals effective this coming fiscal year. We're not alone. Just want to put that out there. If you have any specific questions or ideas for us, we'd be happy to hear.